Good morning. Today is Monday, April 27th, and today we're going to continue where we left off on George Orwell's 1984. So for reference, what we left off with is that our main character is Winston and he lives in Oceania. We found out that he doesn't really agree with the party. During the 2-minute hate, we discussed that he had a look with one of his colleagues, and we have distinguished that Goldstein is the enemy and Big Brother is the hero, and that Winston has started a journal, which is controversial but not 100% illegal. There's a gray area, and he was writing about how he wants Big Brother to go down. Here is chapter 2. As he put his hand to the doorknob, Winston saw that he left the diary open on the table. Down with Big Brother was written all over it, in letters almost big enough to be legible across the room. It was an inconceivably stupid thing to have done. But, he realized, even in his panic, he had not wanted to smudge the creamy paper by shutting the book while the ink was wet. He drew in his breath and opened the door. Instantly, a warm wave of relief flowed through him. The colorless, crushed-looking woman with wispy hair and a lined face was standing outside. "Oh, comrade," she began in a dreary, whining sort of tone. "I thought I heard you come in. Do you think you could come across and have a look at our kitchen sink? It's blocked up and—" It was Mrs. Parsons, the wife of a neighbor who was on the same floor. Mrs. was a word somewhat discountenanced by the party. You were supposed to call everyone comrade, but with some women, one used it instinctively. She was a woman of about 30, but looked much older. One had the impression that there was dust in the creases of her face. Winston followed her down the passage. These amateur repair jobs were almost a daily irritation. Victory mansions were old flats built in 1930 or thereabouts, and were falling to pieces. The plaster flaked constantly from ceilings to walls, and the pipes burst in every hard frost. The roof leaked whenever there was snow. The heating system was usually running at a half steam when it was not closed down altogether from motives of economy. Repairs, except what you could do yourself, had to be sanctioned by remote committees which were liable to hold up even in the mending of a window pane for 2 years. "Of course, it's only because Tom isn't home," Mrs. Parsons said vaguely. The Parsons flat was bigger than Winston's, and dingy in a different way. Everything had a battered, trampled-on look, as though the place had just been visited by some large, violent animal. Games in impedimenta, hockey sticks, boxing gloves, a burst football, a pair of sweaty shorts turned inside out, lay all on the floor. On the table there was a litter of dirty dishes and dog-eared exercise books. On the walls were scarlet banners of the Youth League and the Spies, and a full-size poster of Big Brother. There was the usual boiled cabbage smell common to the whole building, but it was shot through by a sharper reek of sweat, which one knew this at the first sniff, though it was hard to say how, was the sweat of some person not present at the moment. In another room, someone with a comb and a piece of toilet paper was trying to keep tune with the military music which was still issuing from the telescreen. "It's the children," said Mrs. Parsons, casting a half-apprehensive glance at the door. "They haven't been out today, and of course—" She had a habit of breaking off her sentences in the middle. The kitchen sink was nearly full to the brim with filthy greenish water which smelt worse than ever of cabbage. Winston knelt down and examined the angle joint of the pipe. He hated using his hands, and he hated bending down, which was always liable to start him coughing. Mrs. Parsons looked on helplessly. "Of course, if Tom was home, he'd put it in right in a moment," she said. He loves anything like that. He's ever so good with his hands, Tom is." Parsons was Winston's fellow employee at the Ministry of Truth. He was a fattish but active man of paralyzing stupidity and a mass of imbecile enthusiasms. One of those completely unquestioning, devoted drudges on whom, more than ever on the thought police, the stability of the party depended. At 35, he had just been unwillingly evicted from the Youth League, And before graduating into the youth league, he had managed to stay in the spies for a year beyond the statutory age. At the ministry, he was employed in some subordinate posts for which intelligence was not required. But on the other hand, he was a leading figure on the sports committee and all other committees engaged in organizing community hikes, spontaneous demonstrations, saving campaigns, and voluntary activities generally. He would inform you with quiet pride, between whiffs of his pipe, that he had put in an appearance at the community center every evening for the past 4 years. An overpowering smell of sweat, a sort of unconscious testimony to the strenuousness of his life. Followed him about wherever he went, and even remained behind him after he had gone. "Have you got a spanner?" said Winston, fiddling with the nut on the angle joint. "A spanner," said Mrs. Parson, almost immediately invertebrate. I don't know. I'm sure. Perhaps the children." There was some trampling of boots and another blast on the comb as the children charged into the living room. Mrs. Parson brought the spanner. Winston let out the water and disgustedly removed the clot of human hair that had blocked up the pipe. He cleaned his fingers as best he could in the cold water from the tap and went back to the other room. "Up with your hands," yelled a savage voice. A handsome, tough-looking boy of 9 had popped up from behind the table and was menacing him with a toy automatic pistol, while his little sister, about 2 years younger, made the same gesture with a fragment of wood. Both of them were dressed in blue shorts, gray shirts, and red neckerchiefs, which were the uniform of the spies. Winston raised his hands above his head with an uneasy feeling, so vicious was the boy's demeanor, that it was not altogether a game. "You're a traitor," yelled the boy. "You're a thought criminal. You're a Eurasian spy. I'll shoot you. I'll vaporize you. I'll send you to the salt mines." Suddenly, they were both leaping around him, shouting, "Traitor!" and "thought criminal," the little girl imitating her brother in every movement. It was somehow slightly frightening, like the gamboling of tiger cubs, which will soon grow to become man-eaters. There was a sort of calculating ferocity in the boy's eye, and a quite evident desire to hit or kick Winston, and a consciousness of being nearly big enough to do so. It was a good job. It was not a real pistol he was holding, Winston thought. Mrs. Parsons' eyes flitted nervously from Winston to the children and back again. In a better light of the living room, he noticed with interest that there was actually dust in the creases of her face. "They do get so noisy," she said. "They're disappointed because they couldn't go see the hanging. That's what this is. I'm too busy to take them, and Tom won't be back from work in time." "Why can't we go and see the hanging?" roared the boy in his huge voice. "Want to see the hanging? What to see the hanging?" chanted the little girl, still capering around. We're going to stop right here. This is just a very dystopian thing that I feel like could be used as a quote during the argumentative essay or the reflection piece. So hopefully you guys will use this. Some Eurasian prisoners guilty of war crimes were to be hanged in the park that evening, Winston remembered. That happened about once a month and was a popular spectacle. Children always clamored to be taken to see it. He took his leave of Mrs. Parsons and made for the door, but he had gone 6 steps down the passage when something hit the back of his neck in an agonizing, painful blow. It was as though a red-hot wire had been jabbed into him. He spun around just in time to see Mrs. Parsons dragging her son back into the doorway while the boy pocketed a Capulet. "Goldstein!" bellowed the boy as the door closed on him. But what most struck Winston was the look of helplessness fright on the woman's grayish face. Back in the flat, he stepped quickly past the telescreen and down at the table again, still rubbing his neck. The music from the telescreen had stopped. Instead, a clipped military voice was reading out, with a sort of brutal relish, a description of the armaments of the new floating fortress which had been anchored between Iceland and Faroe Islands. With those children, he thought, that wretched woman must lead a life of terror. Another year, 2 years, they would be watching her night and day for symptoms of unorthodoxy. Nearly all children nowadays were horrible. What was worst of all was that by means of such organizations as the spies, they were systematically turning into ungovernable little savages. Yet this produced in them no tendency whether to rebel against the discipline of the party. On the contrary, they adored the party and everything connected with it: the songs, the processions, the banners, the hiking, the drilling with the dummy rifles, the yelling of the slogans, the worship of Big Brother. It was all sort of a glorious game to them. I think this would also be a good thing to use. Like, again, still talking about that dystopian society that we are now instilling only one belief into the kids, which you could argue that we do that now already. I am always here for a hot take or a take in general, but I think a summary of this would be almost exactly like Winston said. That the main goal of creating the spies and to educate the kids into one's belief is that ideally in a new generation, you would not have any rebellions or any backlash to anything that you would say. And I believe that is what the party is trying to do. All of their ferocity turned out outwards against the enemies of the state, against foreigners, traitors, saboteurs, thought criminals. It was normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children, and with good reason, for hardly a week passed in which the Times did not carry a paragraph describing how some eavesdropping little sneak child hero, was the phrase generally used, had overturned some compromising remark and denounced its parents to the thought police. The sting of the catapult bullet had worn off. He picked up his pen half-heartedly, wondering whether he could find something more to write in the diary. Suddenly, he began thinking of O'Brien again. O'Brien is the co-worker that they had that shared moment where they looked at each other, and Winston believes they believe the same thing. Years ago, how long was it? 7 years it must be. He had dreamed that he was walking through a pitch-dark room, and someone sitting to one side of him had said as he passed, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." It was said very quietly, almost casually, a statement, not a command. He had walked on without pausing. What was curious was that at the time, in the dream, the words had not made much impression on him. It was only later and by degrees that they had seemed to take on significance. He could not now remember whether it was before or after having the dream that he had seen O'Brien for the first time, nor could he remember when he first identified the voice of O'Brien. But at any rate of identification existed, it was O'Brien who had spoken to him out of the dark. Winston had never been able to feel sure. Even after this morning's flash of eyes, it was still impossible to be sure whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy. Nor did it even seem to matter greatly. There was a link of understanding between them, more important than affection or partnership. "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness," he had said. Winston did not know what it meant, only that in some way or another it would come true. A voice from the telescreen paused. A trumpet call, clear, beautiful, floated into the stagnant air. The voice continued raspily, "Attention, your attention, please. A news flash has this moment arrived from Malabar front. Our forces in the South and South India have won a glorious victory. I'm authorized to say that the action we are now reporting may well bring the war within measurable distance of its end. Here's the news flash." Bad news coming, Winston thought, and sure, Following a gory description of annihilation of a Eurasian army with stupendous figures of killed and prisoners, came the announcement that, as of next week, the chocolate ration will be reduced from 30 grams to 20. Winston belched again. The gin was wearing off, leaving a deflated feeling. The telescreen, perhaps to celebrate the victory, perhaps to drown the memory of lost chocolate, crashed into Oceana, 'tis for thee. You were supposed to stand to attention. However, in his present position, he was invisible. Oceana, 'tis for thee gave way to lighter music. Winston walked over to the window, keeping his back to the telescreen. The day was still cold and clear. Somewhere far away, a rocket bomb exploded with a dull, reverberating roar. About 20 or 30 of them a week were falling on London at present. Down in the street, the wind flapped the torn poster to and fro, and the word Ickstock fitfully appeared and vanished. Ickstock, the sacred principles of Ickstock, newspeak, doublespeak, the immutability of the past. He felt as though he were wandering in the forests of the sea bottom, lost in a monstrous world where he himself was the monster. He was not alone. The past was dead, the future was unimaginable. What certainty had he that a single human creature now living was on his side? And what way of knowing that the dominion of the party would endure forever? Like an answer, 3 slogans on the white face of the Ministry of Truth came back to him. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. He took a 25-cent piece out of his pocket. There, too, in a tiny clear lettering, the same slogans were inscribed, and on the other face of the coin was the head of Big Brother. Even from the coin, the eyes pursued you, on coins, on stamps, on the covers of books, on banners, on posters, and on the wrappings of a cigarette packet, everywhere. Always the eyes watching you, and the voice enveloping you. Asleep or awake, working or eating, indoors or out of doors, in the bath or in bed, no escape. Nothing was your own except the few cubic centimeters inside your skull. The sun has shifted around in the myriad windows of the Ministry of Truth, with the light no longer shining on them, looked grim as the loopholes of a fortress. His heart quailed before an enormous pyramidal shape. It was too strong. It could not be stormed. 1,000 rocket bombs would not batter it down. He wandered again for whom he was writing the diary, for the future, for the past, for an age that might be imaginary, and in front of him there lay not death but annihilation. The diary would be reduced to ashes and he and himself to vapor. Only the thought police would read what he had written before they wiped it out of existence and out of memory. How could you make the appeal for the future when not a trace of you, not even an anonymous word scribbled on a piece of paper, could physically survive? So this is some insight on Winston's character. He's doubtful. He is resentful. Let's see. This part right here where he says that there's no escape. And this last part right here, I think, are some big takeaways and good quotes to use. Because in the society, we're under the assumption that these civilians, that these people, are more so trying to understand, are not trying to understand. They don't have to understand. Everything is thought of for them. However, with this guy right here, we learned that it's a lot harder than that. That he is starting to think. He's branching out. And when he starts to branch out, he's growing resentful. He's resentful of the slogan, that it's put everywhere in front of him and that he can't escape it. He's resentful about his diary, that he doesn't think that it's going to be important. So he's having an identity crisis. Wrong one. The telescreen struck 14. He must leave in 10 minutes. He had to be back at work by 14:30. Curiously, the chiming of the hour seemed to have put new heart into him. He was a lonely ghost uttering a truth that nobody would ever hear. But so long as he uttered, in some obscure way, the continuity was not broken. It was not by making yourself heard, but by staying sane that you carried on the human heritage. He went back to the table, dipped his pen, and wrote, "To the future or to the past, to a time when thought is free, when men are different from one another and do not live alone, to a time when truth exists and what is done. From the age of uniformity, from the age of solitude, from the age of Big Brother, from the age of doublethink. Greetings." He was already dead, he reflected. It seemed to him it was only now that he had begun to be able to formulate his thoughts, that he had taken the decisive step. The consequences of every act included in the act itself. He wrote, "Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death." Now he had recognized himself as a dead man. It became more important to stay alive as long as possible. 2 fingers of his right hand were ink-stained. It was exactly the kind of detail that might betray you. Some nosy zealot in the ministry, a woman probably, someone like the sandy-haired woman or the dark-haired woman from the fiction department, might start wondering why he had been writing during the lunch interval, why he was used to an old-fashioned pen, what he might be writing, and then drop a hint in the appropriate quarter. He went to the bathroom, carefully scrubbed the ink away with the gritty, dark brown soap which rasped your skin like sandpaper, and was therefore well adapted for this purpose. He put his diary away in the drawer. It was quite useless to think of hiding it, but he could at least make sure whether or not its existence had been discovered. A hair laid across the page ends was too obvious. With the tip of his finger, he picked an identifiable grain of whitish dust and deposited it on the corner, where it was bound to be shaken off if the book was moved. Okay, that is the end of chapter 2. A summary of that. Children learning propaganda. Parents scared. Winston is also scared. Winston decides he's a dead man because he has a journal. Winston is also beginning to question the party. Slogans, life, thoughts. All right, that is chapter 2. I'm also going to add chapter 3, but I'm just going to take a quick break before diving into it. All right, let's get back into 1984 and go to, chapter 3. Winston was dreaming of his mother. He must, he thought, would have been 10 or 11 years old when his mother had disappeared. She was a tall, statuesque, rather silent woman with slow movements and magnificent fair hair. His father he remembered more vaguely as dark and thin, dressed always in neat dark colors. Winston remembered especially the very thin soles of his father's shoes and wearing spectacles. The two of them must evidently have been swallowed up in one of the first great purges of the 50s. At this moment, his mother was sitting in some place deep down beneath him, with his younger sister in her arms. He did not remember his sister at all, except as a tiny, feeble baby, always silent, with large, watchful eyes. Both of them were looking up at him. They were down in some subterranean place, the bottom of a well, for instance, or a very deep grave, but it was a place of which, already far below him, was itself moving downward. They were in the saloon of a sinking ship, looking up at him through the darkening water. There was still air in the saloon. They could still see him, and he them, but all the while they were sinking down into the green waters, which in another moment must hide them from sight forever. He was out in the air, in the light and air, while they were being sucked down to death, and they were down there because he was up here. He knew it, and they knew it, and he could see the knowledge in their faces. There was no reproach either in their faces or in their hearts, only the knowledge that they must die in order that he might remain alive, and that this was part of the unavoidable order of things. He could not remember what had happened, but he knew in his dream that in some way the lives of his mother and sister had been sacrificed to his own. It was those dreams which, while retaining the characteristic dreamy scenery, are a continuation of one's intellectual life, in which one becomes aware of facts and ideas which still seem new and valuable after one is awake. The thing that now suddenly struck Winston was that his mother's death, nearly 30 years ago, had been tragic and sorrowful in a way that was no longer possible. Tragically, he perceived belonging to the ancient time, to a time where there was still privacy, love, and friendship, and when the members of a family stood by one another without needing to know the reason. His mother's memory tore at his heart because she had died loving him, and he was too young and selfish to love her in return. And because somehow, he did not remember how, she had sacrificed her way to a conception of loyalty that was private and unaltered and unalterable. Such things, he saw, could not happen today. Today there were fear, hatred, and pain, but no dignity of emotion, no deep or complex sorrows. All this he seemed to see in the large eyes of his mother and sister, looking at him through the green water, hundreds of fathoms down and still sinking. So, of course, this is symbolism. Because I want to add that the green, I don't think we've really seen a whole lot of green yet. So I'm not sure what green means, but green can mean serenity. Maybe mom and sister were in for a better fate to be dead than to remain alive. And then if mom and sister are here and Winston is here, this could mean something with the patriarchy, that he is above them in status, but also why? Why does he live? Suddenly he was... Let's erase that. Suddenly he was standing on short springy turf on a summer evening when the slanting rays of the sun guided the ground. The landscape that he was looking at reoccurred so often in his dreams that he was never fully certain whether or not he had seen it in the real world. In his waking thoughts, he called it the Golden Country. It was an old, rabbit-bitten pasture with a foot track wandering across it and a molehill here and there. In the ragged hedge on the opposite side of the field, and the burrs of the elm trees were swaying very faintly in the breeze, their leaves just stirring in the dense masses like women's hair. Somewhere near at hand, though, out of sight, there was a clear, slow-moving stream where dace were swimming in pools under the willow trees. The girl with dark hair was coming towards them across the field. With what seemed a single moment, she tore off her clothes and flung them disdainfully aside. Her body was white and smooth, and it aroused no desire in him. Indeed, he barely looked at it. What overwhelmed him in that instant was admiration for the gesture with which she had thrown her clothes aside. With its grace and carelessness, it seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness by a single splendid movement of an arm. It was That too was a gesture belonging to the ancient time. Winston woke up with the word Shakespeare on his lips. The telescreen was giving forth an ear-splitting whistle, which continued on the same notes for 30 seconds. It was not 7:15, getting up time for office workers. Winston wrenched his body out of bed, naked for a member of the outer party received only 3,000 closing coupons annually, and a suit of pajamas was $600, and seized a dingy singlet and a pair of shorts that were lying across the chair. The physical jerks would begin in 3 minutes. The next moment, he was doubled up by a violent coughing fit, which always nearly attacked him soon after waking up. It emptied his lungs so completely that he could only begin breathing again, lying on his back and taking a series of deep gasps. His veins had swelled with the effort of the cough, and the varicose ulcer had also started itching. 30 to 40 group, yapped the piercing female voice. 30 to 40 group, take your places, please. 30 to 40. Winston sprang to attention in front of the telescreen, upon which the image of a youngish woman, scrawny but muscular, dressed in a tunic and gym shoes, had appeared. Arms bending and stretching, she rapped out, Take your time by me. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on, comrades. Put a bit of life into it. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The pain of the coughing fit had not quite driven out of Winston's mind the impression made by his dream, and that rhythmic movements of exercise restored it somewhat. As he mechanically shot his arms back and forth, wearing on his face a look of grim enjoyment which was considered proper during the physical jerks, he was struggling to think his way backward into the dim period of his early childhood. It was extraordinarily difficult. Beyond the late 50s, everything faded. When there were no external records that you could refer to, even the outline of your own life lost its sharpness. You remember huge events which had quite probably not happened. You remember the details of incidents without being able to recapture their atmosphere. And there were long blank periods to which you could assign nothing. Everything had been different then. Even the name of the countries and their shapes on the map had been different. Airstrip 1, for instance, had not been so called in those days. It had been called England or Britain, though London, he felt fairly certain, had always been called London. Winston could not definitely remember a time when his country had not been at war, but it was evident that there had been a fairly long interval of peace during his childhood, because one of his early memories was an air raid which appeared to take everyone by surprise. Perhaps it was the time when the atomic bomb had fallen on Colchester, but he could not remember the raid itself. But he did remember his father's hand clutching his own as they hurried down into some place deep in the earth, round and round a spiral staircase, which rang under his feet, and which finally so wearied his legs that he began whimpering and that they had to stop and rest. His mother, in her slow, dreamy way, was following along behind them. She was carrying his baby sister, or perhaps it was only a bundle of blankets that she was carrying. He was not certain whether his sister had been born then. Finally, they emerged into a noisy, crowded space, which he realized to be a tube station. There were people sitting all over the stone-flagged floor, and other people, packed tightly together, were sitting on metal bunks, one above the other. Winston and his mother and father found themselves a place on the floor, and near them an old man and an old woman were sitting side by side on the bunk. The old man had on a decent dark suit and a black cloth cap pushed back from very white hair. His face was scarlet, and his eyes were blue and full of tears. He reeked of gin. It seemed to breathe out of his skin in place of sweat, and one could have fancied that the tears welling from his eyes were pure gin. But though slightly drunk, he was also suffering under some grief that was genuine and unbearable. In a childish way, Winston grasped that some terrible thing, something that was beyond forgiveness and could never be remedied, had just happened. It also seemed to him that he knew what it was. Someone whom the old man loved, a little granddaughter perhaps, had been killed. Every few minutes, the old man kept repeating, We didn't ought to have trusted them. I said so, Ma, didn't I? That's what comes of trusting 'em, and I said so all along. We didn't ought to have trusted the buggers. But but which buggers had but which buggers they didn't ought to have trusted, Winston could not remember now. Since about that time, war had been literally continuous. Through strictly speaking, it had not always been the same war. For several months during his childhood, there had been confused street fighting in London itself, some of which he remembered vividly, but no trace of history of the whole period. To say who was fighting whom at any given moment, and whom had been utterly impossible, since no written record, no spoken word, ever made mention of any other alignment than the existing one. At this moment, for example, in 1984, if it was 1984, Oceania was at war with Eurasia and in alliance with East Asia. In no public or private utterance was it ever to be admitted that the three powers had at any given time been grouped along different lines. Actually, as Winston well knew, it was only 4 years since Oceania had been at war with East Asia and in alliance with Eurasia, but that was merely a piece of furtive knowledge which he happened to possess because his memory was not satisfactorily under control. Officially, the change of partners had never happened. Oceania was at war with Eurasia. Therefore, Oceania has always been at war with Eurasia. The enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil and followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible. So something I want to highlight that you guys can use for your argumentative essay of like a parallel is this first sentence right here. Because since World War II, I believe that we've been going through a continuous war, right? Because we had the Cold War, then we had, and then after that, it's honestly just been war at the Middle East. Oops, that is not what I wanted. And it's just been that way ever since. That I would argue that you could use that as your parallel. And if we're not at war with the Middle East, then we're giving aid to Israel or we're giving aid to Ukraine. That it's just, there's been continuous war since World War II. The frightening thing, he reflected for the 10,000th time as he forced his shoulders painfully backward, with hands on hips. They were gyrating their bodies from the waist, the exercise that was supposed to be good for the back muscles. The frightening thing that might all be true if the party could thrust its hands into the past and say of this or that event, it never happened, that, surely, was more terrifying than mere torture and death. The party said that Eurasia had never been in alliance with Eurasia. He, Winston Smith, knew that Eurasia had been in alliance with Eurasia as short a time as 4 years ago. But where did that knowledge exist? Only his own consciousness, which in any case must soon be annihilated. And if all others accepted the lie which the party imposed, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and become truth. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan, controls the future, who controls the present, controls the past. Yet the past, though of its nature unalterable, never had been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it, in Newspeak. Double think. Stand easy, barked the instructress a little more genially. Winston sank his arms into his sides and slowly refilled his lungs with air. His mind slid away into the labyrinthine world of double think. To know and to not know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two opinions which canceled out, knowing them to be contradictory and believing in them both, to use logic against logic, to repudiate morality while laying claim to it. to believe that democracy was possible and that the party was the guardian of democracy, to forget whatever it was necessary to forget, then to draw it back into memory again at the moment when it was needed, and then promptly to forget it again, and above all, to apply the same process to the process itself. That was the ultimate subtlety, consciously to induce self-consciousness, and then, once again, to become unconscious of the act of hypnosis you had just performed. Even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. The instructress has called them to attention again. And now let's see which of us can touch our toes, she said enthusiastically. Right over the hips, please, comrades. 1, 2, 1, 2. Winston loathed this exercise, which sent shooting pains all the way from his heels to his buttocks and often ended by bringing on another coughing fit. The half-pleasant quality went out of his medications. The past, he reflected, had not merely been altered, it had been actually destroyed. For how could you establish the more obvious fact when there existed no record outside your own memory? He tried to remember in what year he had heard mention of Big Brother. He thought it had been at some time in the 60s, but it was impossible to be certain. In the party's history, of course, the Big Brother figured as the leader and the guardian of the revolution since its very early days. His exploits had been gradually pushed backwards in time until they extended into the fabulous world of the 40s and the 30s, when the capitalists in their strange cylindrical hats still rode through the streets of London. Sorry, give me 1 second. Where the capitalists in their strange cylindrical hats still rode through the streets of London in great gleaming motor cars or horse carriages with glass sides. There was no knowing how much of this legend was true and how much invented. Winston could not even remember at what date the party itself had come into existence. He did not believe he had ever heard of the word Ingsoc before 1960, but it was possible that in its old speak form, English socialism, that is to say, it had been current earlier. Everything melted into mist. Sometimes, indeed, you could print your fingers on a definite lie. It was not true, for example, as it was claimed in the party history books, that the party had invented aeroplanes. He could remember aeroplanes since his earliest childhood, but you could prove nothing. There was never any evidence. Just once in his whole life, he had held in his hands unmistakably documentary proof of falsification of an historical fact. And on that occasion, Smith, screamed the shrewish voice from the telescreen. 6079, Smith W. Yes, you. Bend lower, please. You can do better than that. You're not trying. Lower, please. That's better, comrade. Now stand at ease, the whole squad, and watch me. A sudden hot sweat had broken out all over Winston's body. His face remained completely unscrutable. Never show dismay, never show resentment. A single flicker of the eyes could give you away. He stood watching while the instructress raised her hands above her head and, one could not say gracefully, but remarkable neatness and efficiency, bent over and tucked the first joint of her fingers under her toes. There, comrades, that's how I want to see you doing it. Watch me again. I'm 39 and I've had 4 children. Now look, she bent over again. You see, my knees aren't bent. You can all do it if you want to, she added as she straightened herself up. Anyone under 45 is perfectly capable of touching his toes. We don't all have the same privilege of fighting on the front line, but we can at least all keep fit. Remember our boys on the Malabar front and the sailors in the floating fortress. Just think what they have to put up with. Now try again. That's better, comrade. That's much better, she added encouragingly. So this one right here, just evidence that everyone is being watched. She added encouragingly as Winston, with a violent lunge, succeeded in touching his toes with knees unbent for the first time in several years. All right, and that is, excuse me, chapter 3. So summary time. Memories of childhood. Mom died for him to live. Winston remembers the truth. Creators of the how do they spell Oceana again? Oceana. That does not look right. Hold on, let's figure out. I'm missing an I. Okay. And then we also, as the reader, see proof that the telescreen is monitoring them. Monitors / watches the people. And then let's see, how long is chapter 4? I think chapter 4 will be a tomorrow thing, but that is all that I have for today. Be sure to like, subscribe, and wait for the next one. I will see you guys tomorrow. Take care.